Hello and welcome. I'm Tara Kelly, Vice President of Policy and Programs for the Municipal Art Society of New York, and I'm delighted to kick things off for tonight's program. First, I want to thank you for joining this conversation during a moment when so many of us are focused on the news coming out of Minneapolis. Back to the task at hand, before we get started, I would like to draw your attention to the chat where the MAS team has placed some helpful tips and details. I would also like to highlight that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There, you can share any questions and our speakers will respond to as many as time allows later in the program. As an organization devoted to protecting the character of our city, MAS is delighted to be hosting this book talk for Names of New York. We advocate for the places in our city that make New York, New York, from the bodega on your corner block to works of public art and local landmarks. In 1998, MAS co-founded Place Matters in partnership with City Lore, recognizing that places hold memories and anchor traditions for individuals and communities and help tell the history of the city as a whole. Indeed, places matter, and so do their names. If I may share a quote from the book, quote, "Declaimed by protesters in the street, a name becomes an assertion of dignity, of rights, and of the refusal to overlook or forget. Names are shorthand, they're synecdoche. They are acknowledgements or shapers of history, containers for memory or for hope. And if names matter so much when they are attached to people, they matter even more when attached to places, as labels that last longer in our minds, on our maps, more than any single human life." Many of you in the audience may know me as a preservationist, but I also have a background in linguistics. I've come to believe that the two are linked, that how we interpret the built environment is the language of a city. For that reason, tonight's conversation is of special interest to me, and I hope you will enjoy it too. It's now my pleasure and honor to introduce our speakers. Our moderator, Thuras, is the co-founder of Atlas Obscura, which aims to inspire wonder and curiosity about the incredible world we all share, from discoveries to stories to experiences and trips. He has co-authored books for Atlas Obscura and even recently launched the Atlas Obscura podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I can't think of a more perfect person to co-lead this deep dive into place. And joining Dylan is our esteemed guest tonight, Joshua Jelly-Schapiro, authors of Names of New York and scholar in residence at NYU's Institute of Public Knowledge, where he also teaches. As a geographer and history buff, his passion for both subjects comes to life in his new book that we will hear more about tonight. His other titles include Island People, The Caribbean and the World, and with Rebecca Solnit, Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City atlas, which was awarded the 2017 Brendan Gill Prize by MAS. Thank you both so much for joining us. And now I turn it over to you, Dylan, to your capable hands.
Thank you, Tara. This is really, really fun and exciting to be here talking with you, Josh. Before we get started, I have like a million questions for you, both very general and very specific. But before we get started, I wanted to give you a chance to actually read a little bit from the book itself, just to give people a sort of framework setup intro. So I would encourage you to do so.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Dylan. And thank you, Tara, for that warm introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here under the aegis of MAS, an organization I love and has been a great supporter of my work and of so many people in the city who care about place. And also a real thrill to be here talking with Dylan. You know, Atlas Obscura has been such a sort of vital outlet and space for, you know, inspiring and sort of feeding the love for place and the sort of sense of wonder in place that's really important to me. And as I tweeted this morning, I said, you know, atlases of the world unite. So here we are, atlases together. Fantastic. So yeah, I'll just read essentially just a few paragraphs from the introduction to this book, which has been a kind of labor of love over the last several years, an excuse to be immersed in words and in place. And as a geographer who's also a writer, you know, place names are where my kind of passion for place and language kind of overlap. And don't be surprised, you'll hear a few lines that Tara already recited graciously, but I've got a bunch more that surround those. So here we go. The power of names. Names matter. Just ask any parent agonizing over what to call a newborn, or any kid burdened with a name they hate. Just think of the song made popular by Johnny Cash about a boy who explains that life ain't easy for a boy named Sue and confronts the father who named him. My name is Sue. How do you do? Now you're gonna die. Whether you traverse your life as a Jane or an Ali or a Joaquin or an Eve, or you decide as a grown-up that you'd rather endure or enjoy it as someone else, we all learn that names mark us. Totems of identity, systems of illusion. Names can signal where we're from, who our people are, who we attach ourselves to, which Bible character or dead relative or living movie star our namers loved best. Murmured by an intimate or yelled by a foe, a name can be an endearment or a curse. Declaimed by protesters in the street, a name becomes an assertion of dignity, of rights, and of the refusal to overlook or forget. Names are shorthand, they're synecdoche. They are acknowledgements or shapers of history, containers for memory or for hope. And if names matter so much when attached to people, they matter even more when attached to places as labels that last longer in our minds and on our maps than any single human life. Name, though it seem but a superficial and outward matter, yet it carrieth much impression and enchantment. That's how Francis Bacon described the matrix of associations we affix, consciously or not, to the public words by which we navigate our days. Place names can bind people together or keep them apart. They can encode history and signal mores. They can proclaim what a culture venerates at one moment in time and serve as vessels for how it evolves and shifts later on. Gettysburg, Attica, Stonewall, Rome, Wall Street, Main Street, Alabama, Prague, Malibu, Beirut, Boca Raton. Place names can summon worlds and evoke epochs in just a few syllables. They can recall long ago events or become, as settings for more recent ones, metonyms for historical change. Place names can become styles of dress, Bermuda shorts, capri pants, or of dance. Once we did the Charleston, now we do the Rockaway. They can hail rebellions or honor heroes or spring like Sleepy Hollow and Zion from books. Whether a name's born of whimsy or faith, whether it was first written down by a cavalier in his log or a bureaucrat in City Hall, its impression and enchantment derives too from the truth that its meaning can't be fully divorced from its roots. In place names lie stories. Stories in the first instance about their coiners. Tales say about the long ago Dutchmen who wandered an island of wetlands and hills that the people who lived there may or may not have called Manhattan, but whose northern acreage those Dutchmen named for a marshy town in Holland called Harlem. Then there are also stories about the complex or contradictory processes by which certain labels come to be recognized as official. Stories about how people, singly or in groups, attach certain attributes to place names that grow iconic. Iconic of, for example, as with 20th century Harlem, Black culture and pride. And stories too about all the ways that such words thus do much more than merely label location. About how these words and their rhythm and sound and how they look rendered into Roman letters or affixed on street signs and maps. May mold it, have the power not merely to locate experience, but to shape it. Not merely to label the locales to which they refer, but also in some mysterious and beautiful way to become part of them, as the writer Henry Porter put it. Portals through which to access the past, place names are also a means to re-examine, especially in times of ire and tumult, what's possible. And nowhere is this more true than in a great city. A place, as the geographer Yifu Tuan wrote, that can be seen as a construction of words as much as stone. Cities are monuments to civilization and creators of encounter. They're nothing if not generators of tales. And if language is consciousness and humans are a place-loving species, then place names, toponyms as they're called, may mold a larger piece of our minds than we think. So that's just the sense of some of the ways in which I care about and obsess over and love place names. So thrilled to be here talking about them with you, Don.
It's so excited to talk to you about all of this. So I have to ask you like what's maybe a little bit of a goofy question, but you go by Joshua Jelly-Schapiro, and so you yourself have a kind of a nickname or like how did that name come to be, and did that feed into your fascination with names?
What a good question. Yes, all of us have names, and I I have a funny one that's easily Googleable. You know, myself and my brother are the only Jelly-Shapiros that I know of. Yeah, so no, my surname, Jelly is Scots-Irish, comes from County Antrim. I like to say it's just kind of Kelly with a J. Apparently there are a lot of Jellies in that part of the world. Shapiro is Jewish, Lithuanian Jewish. My father grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, and his people came through Ellis Island, you know, a century and more ago. So no, my parents just gave me that hyphenated name at birth. But I'm grateful for having a vaguely distinctive, or at least a funny name that got me teased on the playground.
I wondered about that. I wondered if you'd, yeah.
Yeah. No, but anyway, yes, I think that my love for names, does it sort of rest somewhere deep in my psyche? Perhaps. I never thought about it deeply, but names matter. This is so.
Hello. Hopefully, I think I dropped there for a second. Hopefully, I'm back.
Go ahead.
Good. So this is a enormous, gigantic, ridiculous subject to try and tackle. You're dealing with here. I'm going to turn this off and turn it back on. You're dealing with both the enormity of sort of New York geography, New York as a place, and the vastness really of that, and then you're layering a second kind of insane layer, which is all of the history of the naming and linguistics. How did you begin even tackling a sort of a subject this enormous?
Yeah, well, this book really grew out of, in a certain sense, this atlas I worked on, Nonstop Metropolis,
yeah, which is amazing, by the way, and incredible.
Thank you. No, in no small measure inspired by Atlas Obscura and some of the work that you all have done. And Nonstop Metropolis was really this book that was predicated on this idea that all of us live in a city that's shared. All of us live in a city that's our own, which is to say that all of us who live in a city can and do map it in our own way, whether consciously or not. And so that book, included 26 maps of all kinds of different things, languages and fires and basketball courts and so on. But in working on that project, one thing that happened, of course, was that I was just immersed in the basic building blocks of any map of the city, which is to say its names, its labels. And so I think that for me, I essentially grew obsessed with many of these names, with the sort of digging into where they come from, digging into the sort of stories that they tell. And New York City, of course, any place is distinctive in the particular stories behind its names. But New York, like any city or place in the so-called New World, I think there's a particular pleasure in sort of peeling back the layers, in part because there's not that many of them. We're dealing with several centuries, and then of course we get back to indigenous place names, which I'm sure we'll speak about here. But there is this marvelous way in which place names become a way to understand and peel back the layers of history of a place. And then for me, it just hit this sort of passion I have for thinking about how and why place matters. People often ask me, okay, you're a geographer, you went to grad school for geography. What does that mean? You memorize all the capitals in the world or something? And I wish, I don't know all the capitals in the world, but no, what it means is to sort of think about how and why place matters, to invoke that phrase. And so this project, it was a way to kind of dig into that history, but then to kind of try and give it some narrative shape and some sort of rhythm and flow as an account of my journey through these place names. This is not a 1,000-page book. It's quite a short, pithy book, I hope. And so I can't get into every single place name, but I can get into this record of how and why these names have mattered to me, and hopefully to other people.
Yeah, and I'm going to take one step backwards in your life and biography before we sort of go forward and get a little bit deeper into the book. But both of us obviously share this very deep connection and love of place. Yeah. And I'm curious if you remember. I remember sort of some of my earliest memories of like falling in love with a place. There's a place I visited on a road trip called House on the Rock. It's out in Wisconsin. It's one of these kind of singular, bizarro American roadside attractions. It's incredible. that, and then I was like a graffiti urban exploration kid as a teenager, and so I developed this really intimate relationship with place through that way of kind of exploring it and getting into trouble. And I'm curious about how you found your own love of place. What even led you into this kind of fascination with geography and the meaning of place?
Yeah, well, one thing that I think I found in working on Nonstop Metropolis and then in sort of thinking about maps and hanging out with other people who love place and maps is that it seems to be true that many of us, and I certainly sort of put myself in this category, there's something intrinsically sort of fascinating and that exerts a pull on us about a great map, about sort of thinking about the ways in which a place is described or named. I was totally a kid who, it's funny, there's a scene in Conrad, in Heart of Darkness, where he describes the sort of young man looking at a map and atlas and saying, one day I will go here. And I was totally that kid in terms of, my parents had a couple of world atlases around, and I would lie on my stomach, in the living room and just pore over these things. That maps, I have a friend who says, there are two kinds of books, the books that have maps in them and the books that don't. And the kind that's better are the ones that have maps. And that's not just atlases, by the way, right? Think of Tolkien or all the great classics.
I'm a total sucker for a fantasy book map, by the way. When I open a fantasy book and there's a map in the front, I'm like, this is for me. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. And so I mean, certainly all sorts of places I could enumerate, but I grew up, far from New York. I grew up in bucolic Vermont. Though I had family roots in the city and sort of always spent time here and visited the city and so on. And so for me, I mean, honestly, I think one way to think about that question is, the place name itself, New York. New York, and one thing that I write about in this book is that New York, like many of the places within it, is a kind of megaphone of culture. Many of these place names become iconic of things far beyond the city. I mentioned Harlem in that brief reading, but obviously Brooklyn has a sort of balance. Broadway obviously signifies all kinds of things, the Village. But New York itself, one thing I was fascinated to do in this book was dig into the actual etymology of New York, which my linguist friend Ross Perlin at the Endangered Language Alliance sort of hipped me to the layers of New York, right? And one of the things about New York, obviously, there's a way to tell this story about, Richard Nichols showing up in New York Harbor, and he's sponsored by the Duke of York in 1664, and says, okay, this is not New Amsterdam anymore, it's New York. But of course, you can dig further into the origins of York, and it has an origin as a Celtic word, Eforwic, which means place of the yew tree. In England, because you have many more layers to get through, right? It then becomes a Roman word, Eboracum, and then it's a Viking word, and then finally, in Old English, it becomes York. But I love sort of pondering how all these songs and stories about New York, Frank Sinatra singing New York, or a hip hop classic like, Nas's NY State of Mind, right? They're actually sort of hymning the Duke's new place of the yew tree, whether they're thinking of that or not. So in any case, it's remarkable to me and fascinating how so many place names, the origin perhaps gets obscured, but the sound becomes iconic of something. And I think all of us, anyone who's here joining us tonight, I'm sure could sort of articulate what the name New York means to them. And so that's a thing that's always fascinated me about sort of how the meanings of place names can grow and change across time.
It's interesting, just as having traveled a bit over the last decade, to see the ever increasing power of the Brooklyn brand and name, and really to have it become almost totally disassociated from anything concrete about the place, but very a kind of the name is enough. It floats separate and does its power just as a word, and I found that very interesting.
Absolutely, no, I mean, Brooklyn, of course, comes from the Dutch, or broken land, because it was this marshy area that the English, like many names in New York, sort of just riffed on the Dutch sounds to create this sort of new word, which is vaguely Dutch but English. No, and as you say, it's amazing to watch that. Brooklyn, of course, once upon a time was not a kind of beacon of desire. It was, where new arrivals, immigrants showed up, very much a working class sort of place and space. And yes, over recent decades, it's become this kind of, home of the self-consciously hip, or this mecca of gentrification, however you want to typify it. But you know, as you say, and I blame, by the way, Victoria and David Beckham bear a lot of responsibility for the ways in which Brooklyn has become, because they named their kid Brooklyn about 15 years ago. And now Brooklyn is a mainstay on the most popular girls' names in the United States, which is a remarkable commentary on the associations we can lend to a place name. No, and as you say, all around the world, Brooklyn, you know, names restaurants or boutiques.
And almost like the meta power of gentrification, right? Like it's sort of gentrified into like a hypercube, you know, like it extends beyond the actual physical imprint into an almost imagined sort of version of a gentrified Brooklyn. It's very interesting. I have to ask you, you know, you must have gone into this with a fair bit of knowledge. Was there anything in your research that really shocked you or like absolutely surprised you, that just caught you totally unaware or unexpected?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so many, you know, nuggets. I mean, just sort of riffing on trivia about a million different places that, you know, the stories that emerge from, you know, Featherbed Lane in the Bronx is allegedly named for the men who frequented, or I should say, the women who sort of worked in the bordellos in that part of Brooklyn when the Croton Aqueduct was being built, to, you know, the fact that Gramercy Park, which sounds like a kind of elegant English word, is in fact a kind of English riff on the Dutch, on the Crow Marsh, the crooked marsh that was in that part of Manhattan. So essentially just taking those sounds and making them new. So there are a million just sort of facts like that I love stumbling upon and learning, and that I'm sure we'll sort of continue to riff on here. But one thing that I really enjoyed about this project and found most gratifying and perhaps most important in a way is digging into the indigenous history of New York and the indigenous stories, the people, the Lenape people who were here when Henry Hudson showed up, and then the Dutch arrived, spoke an Algonquian language called Muncie. And it was a fascinating thing just to dig into the layers of names that those people left behind, or sort of more accurately put, that colonists kind of heard and wrote down in their alphabet, and that became at least native sounding place names. And, you know, there's many, and we don't necessarily think of them as indigenous. From in New Jersey, Hoboken and Hackensack, and Passaic and Raritan, to in Brooklyn, Canarsie, Rockaway, Queens, Maspeth, Queens, which means bad water, which is amusing if you've been around Newtown Creek. But in any case, just digging into not only those stories, but also there's a fascinating kind of layer to that history, because many of these names were sort of placed on maps, and then there were sort of alleged stories about what they meant. But because the Lenape were essentially pushed off this land quite quickly, you know, their remnants and people were here in small groups and communities until the 19th century. But as a sort of large community, it's gone quite early. But of course, those people didn't disappear completely. The descendants of the Lenape are alive and with us in Oklahoma and in Ontario. And there's been a wonderful kind of push to not only kind of revive and protect the language, of which there are still a few native speakers, but many more people who are passionate about keeping it alive, and to think about what these names actually mean, and to think about the Lenape heritage and the deep roots in this part of the world. And I'd even say, you know, Mannahatta itself, the name of Manhattan, is its own kind of story. And that's the one I'd relay here, is that the place name Mannahatta, of course, originates from one of Henry Hudson's sailors, you know, wrote it down in his log. He said, native people here seem to say that this side of the river is Mannahatta. But it was quite unclear then and since what exactly that sailor heard, what exactly that person he encountered or overheard was trying to convey. And so there's been all kinds of versions about what Mannahatta means. You know, in the 19th century, there's a popular version. This kind of linguist said it meant place where we all became intoxicated, which was later, you know, is amusing in its way, you know, the sort of watering holes of Manhattan, but is also offensive in the sense that it seems to associate Native Americans with drinking in a kind of unthinking way. Later on, there's a interpretation of the Island of Hills, Some have said it's just the Lenape word menating that they for island, which they misheard, saying, "No, that side of the river is an island. If you go over the Harlem River, you'll find out." But our best version, our best guess today, would seem to be that perhaps that expression was Manhattan, which means place where we gather wood for bows and arrows. And that comes to us from a native Lenape speaker up in Canada who makes a good case for that being the story. We don't know certainly, but for certain, I should say, but fascinating just to dig into not only those stories, but to meet some of the people. A woman I know who's teaching Lenape classes once a month for the Endangered Language Alliance in the East Village. So it's wonderful just to encounter those people in that world and to share their kind of passion for reviving this history.
Yeah, it brings up a question, and I'm excited. I think you've already sort of we've started. Josh promised to take me on a little borough by borough tour and talk about different names there, and so I think maybe we'll return to Manhattan and go from there. But it does bring up a question that I had, which is you have a quote in your book from another incredible New York writer, Luc Sant, who writes, New York has no truck with the past, which he wrote in Low Life. And he says, it expels its dead. And there's a whole bunch of specifics about that, literal, figurative, that we can get into. But I did wonder, New York is famous for basically tearing down its past and constantly just building new stuff, constantly churning, never stopping, never really appreciating its own, incredible pieces of history. New York has as many instances of tearing down something incredible as any other city I can think of. So I'm curious, was that a challenge in doing this work? Is sort of you have to peel back. It's not as if place names are static and just get added. They get constantly replaced. So how did it work to sort of sift through, okay, every place name is actually on a timeline of like, it was this, and then it was this, and then it was this. Yeah, I'm just curious about whether that made it challenging to do this work.
Totally. I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, just the scale of New York is obviously daunting, and it's just an immense amount of information to get into. But, the lucky thing here is that if there's anything that's sort of true about New York and the people who love it and live here, is that, it's not short of obsessives and people who are obsessed with New York and its history. And so this book is in many ways a kind of work of synthesizing, the kind of yeoman scholars and people who've been obsessed with place names. And my friend Gilbert Tauber, for example, who runs this website, oldstreets.com, who's, he's spent decades as a retired city planner who's, compiled this incredible list of bygone street names from Paisley Place to all the rest, all the Royal Street, King Street, and George Street. Anyway, he's done a lot of this work with the borough historical societies and so on. And so, in a word, the information is there. It was daunting to kind of dig through. But the challenge, or the sort of excitement of this book, in a certain sense, was to try and essentially, as I say, lend it a kind of essayistic shape and a fun shape, and sort of make these stories come alive by hanging out with people, whether it's people like Gil Tauber, or people like Karen Hunter, who teaches the Lenape classes, or a wonderful Rob Buchanan, who helps run the Billion Oyster Project, is trying to reseed the harbor with oysters, and I had the pleasure of going around on a boat with him to many of the forgotten islands of the harbor. So in any case, my sort of writerly project in that sense is to make these facts come alive. But it is a wonderful thing about New York that, as you say, so much history is constantly kind of buried under or torn down, and which is obviously part of why the work of MAS and all its allies in the city toward preservation, and not just preservation for its own sake, but preservation for the sake of helping us understand the forces and histories that have shaped the city and still shape the city today. So that, which is to say that this book is kind of a gesture of, solidarity and gratitude to all the people who are doing this work. And hopefully I've just helped it shine, or be a collection of stories as much as a collection of facts.
Well, this is just like a little philosophical aside, but I often, there is no there is no clear line between place and story. There just isn't. Like a place is it's collected kind of stories, and so the stories you choose to tell and the stories you choose to remember and the lost things you choose to mourn, I think, are the way you build an internal geography. It's the way you build a place is the story you build around it. And so I think there's for me there's no clear division between kind of story and place.
Amen. Yeah, no, and I think one of the things that's, feels so exciting and important about these conversations now in the city is that, there's so many stories, obviously, and bits of history that are dark or that involve violence or that involve, in the case of New York, this was a slave port. People in the North like to think that wasn't the case, but it was absolutely involved in the slave trade. There are many places named after slavers, as we know, perhaps 70 in the borough of Brooklyn alone. But for me, one of the things that's sort of, as I say, so important and interesting and potent about this moment in the city and these conversations is that we are at least trying to think critically, not only about those histories, obviously, which is vital, but also just about how to make them visible and how to engage them in a productive way. And I think, for example, of on Wall Street now, there's a marker where Wall Street crosses Water Street, which used to be the edge of the water there, which marks where the main slave auction block was in the 17th and 18th century in Manhattan. And that's only the last few years. It kind of grew out of the Occupy moment in Lower Manhattan and sort of activism. But it's such an important and vital thing that now, it's not like it's a massive monument, but that if you're in the know or that it's there, that you can go down Wall Street, sort of icon of American capitalism, and understand that part of the story of American capitalism is the story of slavery. And that's a absolutely vital thing for all of us to be aware of and to reckon with. And so I think for me, it's like these efforts to kind of make the past visible and to make the place names speak is such a vital thing. And I think there's so much really important and good work going on right now in that regard that, a couple decades ago really wasn't happening. So that's an exciting and positive thing, I think.
Yeah, I also feel like knowing, I remember when I first moved to New York and someone told me the history of Canal Street and like the canal, and I was like, what? Like, what are you talking? I feel like understanding more of the meaning behind a place name and sometimes how it's really very literal or has a very kind of concrete physicality to it, or did at one point, suddenly it lets you engage with the city in a totally different level. I mean, that's always true of sort of gaining historical perspective, but something about the name in which is familiar and present, pulling back to this much distant moment in history in a very kind of concrete way. I've always found that sort of really powerful. And so has it changed the way you experience the city at all, the research on the book?
Yeah, well, one of the sort of basic, inspirations for the book is just the sense of wonder and sort of the ways in which it can sort of just make your day better to be, out on the ferry to Brooklyn and to, understand that the Buttermilk Channel, for example, allegedly comes from essentially two versions. One is, right, that farmers who were bringing milk to Manhattan from Brooklyn were convinced that the rough waters would turn their milk into butter. Another version that it was so shallow that cows would cross it at low tide. I always heard the low tide cow crossing version. Yeah. Right. So there's always sort of debate about these things, but yeah, exactly. But the point is just that I think that for me, that's a sort of baseline point of this book, and one of the pleasures of research is just to be able to walk around the city and sort of put yourself in mind of the histories that made this place.
I'm going to put you on the spot with a really specific question. Maybe you've been to many of the small islands or in and around New York. Youthant Island. Have you heard of it? Are you familiar with it?
I am familiar with it. Absolutely.
What is the story behind Youthant?
Yeah. So Youthant Island is visible is off in the East River, right by the UN, also known as Belmont Island, and was named after a Secretary General of the UN. Its sort of new name came to be in the 70s, I believe. But the story of Utan Island is that it was not, it's a man-made island in the sense that it's actually just the sort of rubble and fill that was sort of created when there was a subway brought to Astoria, Queens, under the East River. If my memory serves, it was Mr. Steinway, the people behind Steinway Pianos in Astoria, who had a kind of vested interest in having a better transit, mode of transit between Manhattan and Astoria. And so it was behind the creation of that subway tunnel. So yeah, you then have this little pile of rubble in the East River, which was named Belmont Island for a long time, became Utan Island, was fascinatingly occupied in the 70s or 80s by a movement, was it the peace movement at the UN? They sort of occupied this island for a bit. The artist Duke Riley occupied it once for a day, flew a flag from it, declaring it sovereign territory. So in any case, has totally sort of colorful history there. But fascinating the sort of ways in which a place like that comes to be, and then the sort of set of histories that grow from it. And I'll tell you just one other little anecdote about the story of it. I love those of you who are attending here and perhaps know that part of Queens or live there or wear this, I'm sure. But Astoria, right, is fascinating because it was named for John Jacob Astor, the patriarch of the Astors, the so-called landlords of New York, who made his fortune in fur trading, but then became even wealthier from real estate. And it's amusing because Astoria is named after him, but he never set foot there. Essentially, the sort of founders of this new village in the 1840s were hopeful that he'd give them money, and so named it in his honor, Astoria. They could see his grand mansion across the East River, but he never turned up there. So in any case, a sort of amusing anecdote about how a place name comes to be, but how it can be many things.
Yeah, I just happened to be working on a different piece for the podcast about spite houses, little houses built to like spite your neighbor or your brother. And I came across this thing about how, you know, the Waldorf, it was originally just the Waldorf Hotel. And there's a story that he built, the original Waldorf was built to spite his aunt who lived next door. So he tore down his mansion and built this 13-story tall hotel and didn't put any windows on the side that faced his aunt. And then his cousin and rival Astor built the Astoria. And then eventually they merged. They lived, like 4 years later, they became one. But the Astoria was actually built as a spite hotel against the first spite hotel that was built against. Anyway, it sounds like a nice family.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. No, it makes me think of, like, of course, addresses matter to people too. There's a big brouhaha some years ago when certain Donald Trump, had the Trump International Tower by Columbus Circle, and he petitioned to have the official address be 1 Central Park West, right, rather than Columbus Circle, because he wanted the prestige of the address. So addresses signify many things, as we know.
Absolutely. So, okay, I've been promised a borough, 5-borough tour of New York. So we talked a little bit about Manhattan and the Lenape name and what, where that came from. Where do you want to go next? Do you want to go sort of into Brooklyn? You want to go up through Queens? I used to lived in Greenpoint, so I did the Manhattan 7 to Queens into Brooklyn move a lot. So.
Yeah, well, we could let's see, why don't we we'll do rapid fire because we can get into some questions here.
Cool.
So attending. Queens stories that I love. Queens is particularly rich in, because it was developed late, Queens was farmland up until very late, getting into the 30s and 40s, right, even. Much of Eastern Queens was undeveloped. And Queens, so it's full of these sort of developments that are, in many cases, named after the developer, right? So you have Rego Park was built by the Real Good Construction Company, for example. Jackson Heights developed by the Queensboro Corporation. not at all high. It's in fact a very low-lying part of Queens, but heights lends it prestige, right? And one that I love, Arverne by the Sea, down by the Rockaways. And this is a kind of great, it's Arverne and Arverne by the Sea, a great example of just sound shaping a place name. The developer who built Arverne, a guy called Remington Vernon, and his wife, it seems, loved the way that he signed his checks, which was just R. Vernon. And so she convinced him to name this place Arverne, and it's still with us. You know, it's a remarkable thing. Another sort of development that was never built but left a place name is a place literally called Utopia, which is ironic in the sense that the literal meaning of utopia is, right, a place that doesn't exist. But what we do have is Utopia Parkway, which is a remnant of the developer who was trying to build Utopia as this development that was going to be open to Jews and people of all colors, as many of the developments at that time were not. So it's a sort of sad story. The development never happened, but we have Utopia Parkway. So there's some Queens bits for you. What should we do next? Bronx, real quick.
Let's swing through Brooklyn. I mean, like I said, I lived in Greenpoint. I loved the street names in Greenpoint because they connected so literally to the shipping industry. You know, it was like Java, India, Ash. There was like all of these street names there that were really tied to the place, and I always really liked that. But I'm curious, were there sort of Brooklyn names or stories that you came across that you really connected with?
Yeah, well, two of a similar sort where it's just like a bunch of names that sort of cohere thematically. In Crown Heights, for example, you know, there's all these streets that people who I'm sure some people here are familiar with them, named after towns upstate, you know, Utica, Troy, Schenectady, Buffalo. And what's interesting about that is that they actually go in order of a journey along the Erie Canal. And so what that is the surveyor, when they broke up the Lefferts farm there in the middle of the 19th century, essentially wanted to, it seems, honor the opening of the Erie Canal a couple decades before. And so sort of overlaid this geography onto another geography. So I love that example.
That's really cool. I used to live before Greenpoint. I was on New York Avenue down in.
There you go. So the beginning of the thing.
Yeah, exactly. The beginning of the journey. Okay, so that's good. Maybe we'll go back up. I know so this is one thing I want to talk to you about. Now we're like, our geography is getting all mixed up. We're taking a long train ride all over the place. But let's go up to the Bronx, and I wanted to talk about eponymous place names, basically street names, square names, place names named after people, because there's some amazing names in the Bronx named after more recent figures, hip hop, famous musicians for the most part. So I'm curious. I would love to hear a little bit about that and about New York's history of sort of those kinds of names.
Totally. Well, you know, it's great you asked that in the same week that Big Pun, the great MC, great MC, got his own street up in the Bronx in the Grand Concourse. So
I did not hear that. That's awesome.
There you go. I saw the news story the other day. But yeah, there are many of these, right? DJ Scott Barak Place and all these others. Regis Philbin Way, you know, sort of heralding native sons and daughters of the borough. But the story of honorary street names, it's a fascinating one. And one of the things that's unique about New York, because from the 1990s on, 1992 specifically, there's a local law that was passed, Local Law 28, which made it much easier for City Council to essentially sort of pass these honorary secondary street names, which is something that you don't really see in other cities nearly as much, but it's something that has become a hugely popular thing in New York. Now I think it's a quarter of the local laws that City Council passes every year, gives these sort of names to streets. And some people think, some people feel like, it's a little excessive. But of course it is this wonderful second order geography, some celebrities, some kind of, but many and people who died tragically or police and firefighters who died in the line of duty. So it is a kind of wonderful, to me, second order geography that kind of maps meaning in the city in a wonderful way.
Yeah. We of course, as always, left out Staten Island. Anything you want to say about Staten Island and its kind of history of place names? Also, I believe there's a Wu-Tang. I don't know, is it a street or a square or?
It's a Wu-Tang district, an entire district.
It's a whole district. I forgot. Okay.
Yeah, there's an entire district, and then so let's do Staten Island, and then let's get into some questions from folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so Staten Island, a good one there is so there's Father Capodanno Boulevard, which honors a local son of Staten Island who was regarded as a great kind of heroic figure in during the Vietnam War for his bravery and sort of going out to sort of offer last rites to fallen soldiers and was sort of martyred in Vietnam. In any case, a beloved figure in Staten Island. Has a boulevard named after him. The thing I love about that is that Capodanno, who's a sort of rapper affiliated with the Wu-Tang Clan, the great hip hop heroes of Staten Island, I would be shocked if his name isn't in part inspired by Capodanno Boulevard, right?
That's amazing.
Right, and I think that it's also the case that Wu-Tang Clan, for those who grew up on hip hop and listened to them, right, did create this whole mythic geography of the city. They call Staten Island Shaolin and Harlem is Mecca and so on. But now, with a fair bit of justice, I'd say they have a whole district in Staten Island called the Wu-Tang District, and so it's not far from Capodanno Boulevard. So things come full circle.
That's an amazing piece of place linguistic hip hop trivia. That's like a rare in my Venn diagram. Rarely do I get something that fits so neatly. Well, let's take some questions, and there's a good number kind of coming in. So in order, there's a question, and maybe you won't know some of these, and it's fine.
Yeah, no. I've gotten used to it. I was on the radio the other day and people threw all kinds of stuff at me. I don't know every name in New York, but I love talking about it.
I bet you're pretty good. You're pretty good though. So there's a question about the Quaker Meeting House in Queens and whether that's the oldest religious building in the city.
Interesting. Oldest religious building. I would venture to say yes. Oldest buildings. Each of the boroughs sort of has a claim on oldest building. The Onderdonk House on the borough of Queens and Brooklyn is one. The Riker House, which is in Elmhurst, Queens, not far from LaGuardia Airport. Oldest house of worship. I'm going to guess that that's the case. Don't quote me on it. You can look it up on the internet in a minute. But of course, one of the things about that part of Queens, about Flushing, Queens, with Bound House there and the Quaker Meeting House, is that there is this remarkable sort of history there of not only kind of American religious history and religious freedom, but this tradition of toleration and of religious liberty that's really inscribed as part of New York's story in large measure because of the Flushing Remonstrance and the insistence in Dutch days to allow people to worship as they wish, which is really a part of why I think New York is at least in certain ways more central to the sort of ideals of the American Revolution than Puritan New England was, but I digress.
So someone asked about if you could speak to the WPA guides of place names.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I love the WPA guides to place names. I think there was a great flourishing of kind of American culture, bar none, but also just a sort of passion for American history and a place during the Depression. One of the great kind of inspirations for this book, there's a great book called Names on the Land, which is in the WPA book. It was written in the 40s by a guy called George Stewart, which is this wonderful kind of just essay about American place names. And I think that, the passion of that era for sort of Americana and for the uniqueness of American place is a marvelous thing. I think that one of the things, hopefully, that I've been able to do or try to think about, right, is sort of thinking about, obviously, the sort of ways in which questions of power and questions of social justice have sort of shaped American place names in ways that weren't necessarily at the forefront at that time. But I love those books in that era of American sort of love of place.
I'm going to go a little out of order here. Just Did you come across anything on Gun Hill Road in the Bronx, or how it got its name?
Totally. I mean, Gun Hill Road, I love it up there. Now home to many immigrants from the Caribbean and from Jamaica in particular. It's a place I spend a lot of time. Yeah, Gun Hill Road, it dates from Revolutionary War time. There was a sort of installment of fortification there. One or other of George Washington's campaigns against the British. I can't quote you the precise history, but it's a Revolutionary War name, and it names the place that was vital to certain skirmishes back then.
Someone's just named a favorite street name, which is Force Tube Avenue, which that's a new one on me. Force Tube Avenue in Cypress Hills, Brooklyn. That is an excellent New York
awesome.
street.
Yeah, that's tough to beat. Force Tube Avenue.
Okay, that's for further research. So people wanted to know, actually, there's a great question here about streets named for women. Obviously, there is a huge preponderance of streets named after dudes in New York, but I'm curious about whether you got a sort of a sense of that breakdown and whether that's changing at all.
Absolutely, I love that question. One of the maps that I worked on for Nonstop Metropolis is this map called City of Women, which is a map that essentially, in ways, the simplest map in the book. We just took the subway map, the most iconic map of the city, and renamed every subway stop for nearly everyone for an illustrious woman who had either lived in or left her mark in that part of the city. And of course, part of what we were sort of implicitly suggesting are the ways in which, as my collaborator Rebecca Solnit puts it, we live in a manscape, as she puts it, in New York or any city you can imagine, really, which is to say that 90+% of everything is named after men. And in New York, certainly, just look at statues. Up until very recently, we had something like 195, if I'm getting the number right, of statues and monuments dedicated to actual real life men who existed in history. And we had just a few women. Up until recently, there was 4, I believe. Now we've gained a Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth in Central Park, Mr. Harriet Tubman in Harlem. Shirley Chisholm is going into Prospect Park in a couple of years. And there is a real concerted effort to try and kind of correct this imbalance, and it's a vital one. And I think that one of the things we learned in making the City of Women map was to sort of look at the ways in which people responded and sort of spoke to the ways in which inhabiting a city that kind of honors your gender or your people is a different experience from inhabiting one that doesn't. So I think that this is a vital conversation, and I hope it continues, and we see many more places and statues dedicated to women.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone a local New Yorker wants to know why a street name right near Woodlawn Cemetery might be called King's College Place. Any thoughts there?
What a good question. I do not know. I can tell you that the original name of Columbia University was King's College in British colonial times. So I wonder if, in some odd way, that was a little bit of Queens that was sort of affiliated with Columbia College or King's College, as it was known then.
Got it. There's a couple others, although I think we've got some answers are getting taken care of in the comments. Let's see. This is your chance. We got a few more minutes, so you got a burning question. Awesome. So here's a good one. If a street with a number has been renamed for a person, is it part of the designation that the number and the name cannot be on the same sign? I sometimes need to know the number. Can the petition to have it put along with the new name? There's a question about sort of this renaming process and what happens to the old designation, whether it be a number or another name.
That's a great question. I mean, one of the things about the honorary or sort of second street names is that the reason the city kind of adopted it is because literally the people who are in charge of keeping the city map, which they kept on these huge Mylar sheets, really didn't want to keep actually changing names. And so they said, let's do these secondary names, which are official in the sense that they're on the street, but they're not on the kind of map for tax purposes and so on. So it's a great question. I mean, I can give you an amusing example in this vein is, the Avenue of the Americas, for example. In the 1940s, Piero LaGuardia led the push to name 6th Avenue Avenue of the Americas to kind of give it some new cachet as compared to, celebrated 5th Avenue, and was going to have all the embassies of Latin American countries there. And they did this, it officially became the Avenue of the Americas. Of course, many of the people who lived on or did business on 6th Avenue really didn't have much use for this new name. And finally, in the 80s, the city relented and returned the actual 6th Avenue signs there. So now it officially has both names. But I think that's an instructive example of the ways in which, right, sometimes changing a name, if people don't want to use it, it doesn't happen. And just a one-sentence example, 125th Street in Harlem, right, is also Martin Luther King Boulevard. New York, like many cities and towns across America, has a street honoring Dr. King and his vision. But the ironic thing there is that 125th Street, right, is already long since sort of been an icon and symbol of Black freedom and Black freedom struggles and culture and pride. And so very few people actually call 125th Street MLK. It's 125th Street. So sometimes the numbers become iconic too.
Yeah, if the story is already attached, it's like you don't need to kind of well, we only got a couple minutes left. I want to just urge everyone to buy Names of New York. It's a wonderful, delightful, just trip through the city in a way that for me was really interesting and exciting. So I urge all of you to go out and snap it up. You can purchase a copy at the link that was just dropped in the chat. Nonstop Metropolis is also a true New York classic. It is on I was like really tempted. Hang on. It's with my New York books. I don't know quite where it is. I don't want to spend too much time. I was so tempted to go and pull it down, but it's an absolute gem of a book in every possible way. I could not more highly recommend Josh's work and scholarship. And so I think with that, I should invite, anything else you want to say, Josh, before we hand it back over?
No, just a heartfelt thank you to you, Dylan, for a lovely chat, for doing this, and to MAS, an organization I love and will continue to support and tout. So thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, and likewise, this has been an absolute joy, and I feel really privileged to be, speaking at MAS and speaking with you, Josh. So, all right, with that, I think I will hand it back over to Tara.
Thank you both so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Josh, apologies for scooping some of your quote. You read it much better than I did. And as we heard so poignantly tonight, names are important. It's true for places, but especially for people. And so looking towards Minneapolis, we're reminded that we must say their names. I'd like to thank Dylan and Josh again for their time and for touring us around the places and eras of New York City history. Josh's book is now available for purchase, as Iana put into the chat. Speaking of Iana, I want to thank her and her colleague Jackie Mualim for putting this event together this evening. And our thanks extend to Sarah New at Pantheon Books for her help in coordinating. I hope that if you're not already a member of MAS, that you'll consider joining. Your membership dollars and donations help us to continue to provide programming like this and support for our continued policy and advocacy work towards a more livable city. We hope you'll stay tuned for upcoming MAS programs and tours by visiting mas.org/events. If you'd like to be inspired by the stories of women activists, like we just heard about women place names, please join us next week on Monday, April 26th at 5 p.m. for Her Story in Place. Also, our Janeswalk Festival is coming up May 3rd to 9th with something for everyone to enjoy, from virtual activities to self-guided strolls. Learn more about this volunteer-led festival of neighborhood storytelling by visiting mas.org/JanesWalk NYC. Have a great evening and hope to see you all next time.
Thank you all so much.